And welcome once again to Jay's Retro Toys and Games. It's Friday, February 11, 2022. This is episode number 3, and we're glad that you're with us here for another edition of what is to be a toy or a game tonight, as we talk about something that I think is both a toy and a game, because it's a beautiful piece of artwork and it's playable at the same time. And it sounds like this. That's right. That's what it sounds like. We're talking about the game that was invented by Ralph H. Baer and Howard J. Morrison, working for the toy design firm Marvin Glass and Associates, with software programming by Lenny Cope. And this device creates a series of tones and lights and requires a user to repeat the sequence. If the user succeeds, the series becomes progressively longer and more complex. Once the user fails or the time limit runs out, the game is over. What are we talking about? We're talking about the classic 1978 game that made history. We're talking about Simon, next on Jay's Retro Toys and Games. All right, we welcome you to the show tonight and hope that you are doing well on this Friday, February 11th, 2022. Let's get into the history of Simon, because we got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Ralph H. Baer and Howard J. Morrison, they were introduced to Atari's arcade game Touch Me at the Music Operators of America trade show in 1976. Baer said of the product, "Nice gameplay, terrible execution, visually boring, miserable, rasping sounds." The prototype built by Baer used the low-cost Texas Instruments TMS 1000 microcontroller chip, which was in many games of the 70s. Lenny Cope, who was one of Ralph H. Baer's partners, programmed the core of the game, titled Follow Me, at this time. Baer developed the tones of the game inspired by the notes of a bugle. When they pitched the demo, an 8x8-inch console, to the Milton Bradley Company, the name of the game was changed to Simon. Simon debuted in 1978 at a retail price of $24.95, that's equivalent to $99 in 2020, and became one of the top-selling toys that Christmas. U.S. patent 4207087. Microcomputer-controlled game was granted in 1980. Milton Bradley soon capitalized on the original with both the smaller-sized Pocket Simon and the expanded 8-button Super Simon. Many variants of Simon have been made since Hasbro acquired Milton Bradley in the 1980s, building on the possibilities offered by advances in technology. The original Super Simon was reinvented in 2003 as a hexagonal unit with 6 buttons, which was only released in Europe. 2000 saw Simon Squared, or Simon, to the square power, a unit with 4 traditional buttons on one side and a set of 8 smaller buttons on the other. In 2004, Hasbro released the Simon Sticks. The game features 2 electronic sticks modeled after drumsticks, an emphasis on the musical part of the game, and features 4 levels of play. In 2005, Hasbro released Simon Trickster, also known as Simon Tricks in Europe and in the UK, and as Simon Genius in Brazil, which features 4 game modes in a similar fashion to another Hasbro game called Bop It, and colored lenses instead of buttons. Simon Classic mode plays up to 35 tones or notes. Simon Bounce is similar to Simon Classic, but instead the colors of the lenses change. Simon Surprise is one of the most difficult games in the unit. Every lens becomes the same color, and the player has to memorize the location. Simon Rewind requires the player to memorize the sequence backwards. And during each game, the player is paid a compliment after a certain number of tones is completed. On reaching 5 and 11 tones, the computer will randomly choose awesome, nice, sweet, or respect. On reaching 18 tones, the game will play a victory melody 3 times. And on reaching the ultimate 35 tones, the game will play the victory melody again and will say respect. If the player fails to memorize the pattern or fails to press the right color within the time limit, the game will play a crashing sound and the game will say letter I, or later. 2011, Hasbro introduced Simon Flash. In this version, the game is played with 4 cube-shaped electronic modules that the player must move around depending on the game mode. 2013, they reinvented Simon once again with Simon Swipe. This game was demonstrated at a New York Toy Fair in 2014 and released that summer. The game is a circular unit that looks like a steering wheel, and it has been extended from 4 buttons to 8 touchscreen buttons, which are flattened out on the unit. The game features 4 game modes called levels. The main game, Classic, Party, and Extreme. The player has to go through all 16 levels to beat the game. Classic, Party, and Extreme levels focus on one pattern, getting longer and longer until the player is out. A smaller version of the game called Simon Micro Series was introduced in the fall of 2014. This version has only 2 game modes called Solo and Pass It, and features 14 levels and 4 buttons. There's also a version of Simon created by Basic Fun, known as the Touch Simon. This version has an LCD screen and plays melodies at specific parts of the game. Then in 2016, Hasbro launched the follow-up to Simon Swipe with Simon Air. The game was announced at a Hasbro press conference before the 2016 New York Toy Fair. This version of Simon uses motion sensors, similar to those in Mattel's Loops line of games. The game has 3 game modes: Solo, Classic, and Multiplayer. A button-pressing version of Simon was also released in the U.S. with an aesthetic recalling that of the 1970s and 80s models. Recently, Hasbro has released Simon Optics, a headset game with a motion sensor technology similar to Simon Air. The device has 4 colored buttons, each producing a particular tone when it's pressed or activated by the device. A round in the game consists of the device lighting up 1 or more buttons in a random order, after which the player must reproduce that order by pressing the buttons. As the game progresses, the number of buttons to be pressed increases, and this is only one of the games on the device. There are actually other games on the original. Simon is named after the simple children's game of Simon Says, but the gameplay is based on Atari's unpopular Touch Me arcade game from 1974. Simon differs from Touch Me in that Touch Me buttons were all of the same color. They were black, and the sounds it produces were harsh and grating. So Simon's tones, on the other hand, were designed to always be harmonic, no matter the sequence, and consisted of an A major triad and second inversion resembling a trumpet fanfare. The E note was the blue, lower right, a C sharp note, yellow, left, lower left, A note, red, upper right, E note, green, upper left, and an octave lower than the blue. Simon was later re-released by Milton Bradley, now owned by Hasbro, in its original circular form, though with a translucent case rather than the plain black. It was also sold as a 2-sided Simon squared version, with the reverse side having 8 buttons for head-to-head play, and as a keychain officially licensed by Fun for All, with simplified gameplay, only having Game 1 Difficulty 4 available. Other variations of the original game no longer produced include Pocket Simon and the 8-button Super Simon, both from 1980. Nelsonic released an official wristwatch version of Simon. Later versions of the game included a pocket version of the original game in a smaller, yellow oval-shaped case. Another iteration, Simon Trickster, plays the original game as well as variations in which the colors shift around from button to button, called Simon Bounce. The buttons have no colors at all, and Simon Surprise and the player must repeat the sequence backwards. Simon Rewind. A pocket version of Simon Trickster was also produced. Then in 2014, version of Simon called Simon Swipe. The notes are as follows. The G note was blue, the C note was yellow, the E note was red, and then there was another G note, green, that was an octave higher than the blue. The swiping sounds are presented with sliding between notes. The bigger the slide, the bigger the swipe will be. The exact notes and sound effects were also used for a smaller version called Simon Micro Series. The sounds were then recreated for Simon Air and Simon Optics. Of course, as a popular game, Simon inspired many imitators and knockoffs. Atari released a handheld version of Touch Me in 1978 with multicolored buttons and pleasant musical tones. Though named for the older arcade game, the handheld Touch Me contained Simon's 3 game variations and 4 difficulty levels, albeit with limits of 8, 16, 32, and 99 instead of 8, 14, 20, and 31. Even its button layout mirrored that of Simon, though upside down, with blue in the upper left, yellow in the upper right, red in the lower left, and green in the lower right. Its only unique features were an LED score display similar to that of its arcade counterpart, and its small size similar to that of a pocket calculator. Other clones include Monkey See, Monkey Do, which featured a similar casing as that of Simon, except that the buttons were oval-shaped. Tiger Electronics' Copycat in 1979, re-released with a transparent case in 1988 and using buzzers. Repackaged and released by Sears as Follow Me, released as Copycat Jr. in 1981, and as Pocket Repeat by Tandy Computers and Radio Shack. Castle Toys Einstein in 1979, Genius, launched in the 80s in Brazil by Branquitos Estrella, Space Echo by an unknown company. Mackenzie has a DIY version that requires soldering. Another DIY version called Electronic Memory Game used or based on ARM Cortex microcontrollers. The Game A mode of the second game in the Game & Watch handheld series Flagman. Game B is the same but doesn't play in a sequence, while the player has a limited time to press the corresponding number lit up. R2-D2 Ditto Droid, a Star Wars version featuring R2-D2 sounds and Star Wars themed graphics by Tiger Electronics in 1997. VTEX Wizard, a side quest in both the Super NES and Game Boy Advance versions of Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, that involves freeing creatures called banana birds using buttons on each system's controller, Soviet Electronica, IEO1 Evolga, nearly an exact visual replica of Simon, Oddworld Games, in which the playable character must progress by completing certain puzzles with a sequence of sounds. The same gameplay also appears on multi-game handhelds such as Tiger Electronics' Brain Warp and Brain Shift games. Instead of tones, the game unit issues a recorded voice that calls out colors and numbers in Game 4, Memory Match. Brain Shift has 2 memory games, Game 2 and Game 3, that's Memory Shift and Who Shifts It, that call out colors. Mego Corporation's Fabulous Fred, Game 3, the memory game. Parker Brothers' Merlin, Game 3, Echo. Atari also included a 9-button version of Touch Me as game variations 1 through 4 out of 19 on the 1978 Brain Games cartridge for the Atari 2600. A fan-made version of Simon was unofficially made available from Modded Wii's in 2008. A Harry Potter wand released in 2001 called Harry Potter Magic Spell Challenge had Simon gameplay and voice commands. Wingardium to tilt the wand down, and Lavosia to tilt the wand up. Toytronics Gotcha, a similar handheld with 8 buttons instead of 4, produced in a rounded big version and a smaller pocket one. Now, some versions of the game have tones that play as long as the button is depressed, but others have a constant sound duration. Some versions feature audio themes, such as animals, a xylophone, football, and space sounds, some of which make the game easier to play, and some versions also have a sound on-off setting, which can make the game harder with only visual clues. In popular culture, it was featured in the 1987 Stephen King novel, The Tommyknockers. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Little Miss Gamer. In Family Guy episode Perfect Castaway, Stewie plays with Simon and makes up his own song lyrics. In American Dad episode The One That Got Away, the family becomes addicted to the game, playing it for days without moving. In the film 2009 Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, Flint, the main character, has to click the correct sequence on Simon to get into his lab. It showed up in the 2012 Cougar Town episode, You Can Still Change Your Mind. In 2014 film Paranormal Activity, the Marked Ones, a Simon game is possessed by a demon and works as a mock Ouija board. Oh! In a Robot Chicken sketch, Dick Cheney's heart is replaced with a Simon in a parody of Iron Man. Ooh. The concept was used as the bonus round in the British game show Ant and Dex Push the Button, with 5 colors, and extra being purple and having the name Dave. A mini-game resembling Simon appeared in the 2002 video game Sabrina the Teenage Witch. A Simon game designed by Baer is on permanent display at the American Computer and Robotics Museum in Bozeman, Montana. And the list keeps going on and on. And there you have it, folks. A look at the toy or the game, or both, that started a revolution in 1978 and has come full-fledged for 43 years. Simon, thank you very much to the designers and, of course, to Mattel and Hasbro for keeping this game so simplified and yet, to some, very, very hard. Next time on the program, we'll be looking at the highest selling toys for boys. One of the highest, Transformers. Oh, yeah. That's coming up on Monday's edition of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. That's on episode number 4. I'm Jason Icanio. Have a great weekend. We will see you for episode 4. And remember, always keep playing those games because you never know. You may get there eventually and beat those games like you always wanted to beat them when you were a young kid. We'll see you on Monday. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Democracy Network for great more content like this one.